Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as historical document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. Carl, how are you?
I am great. Were you just at the beach or something like that? Or
Yeah, well, listen, we're just wrapping up all the summery activities. So we're hitting theme parks, we're seeing family, we're going to the beach, we're just kind of doing it all, man.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kim and I were at the beach about 3 weeks ago. Really nice. It was not very crowded where we were. We were in Daytona. I haven't been to Daytona in a while, and Daytona is trying to recover still from hurricanes. I should stop right there unless I say something that would be unappreciated by anybody. But the beach was lovely. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, we forget what we have here in Central Florida. You're like,
yeah.
Great. This is nice.
It's right there, and theme parks and beautiful weather without the hurricanes, of course. But that's okay. It's all good.
Yeah.
Love to see the ocean, mostly because it, like a lot of things in nature, for me, reminds me that, in my opinion, this was all designed. And it points its way to this thing we've said before about there kind of being a maker.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah. So Here we are, episode 3.
Yeah. And so here in this exploration that we are on, we have been examining the central aspect of what our founders here in the U.S. thought was central. Not the only thing, certainly not the only thing necessary for our country to operate. And we got into that in a previous podcast series we did called Unmoored. You should definitely check that out. But where we are now is an adjacent exploration, kind of digging into the historical evidence that backs up the Christian faith. So leads to the title that we're calling Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document.
Yeah, because the founders, again, they felt like it was necessary for this system of, say, government of the people to work. There had to be an internal, common moral virtue foundation. And for them, a key part of it, a key piece, was Christianity, not because they were necessarily trying to insert like a Christian nationalism viewpoint, but because they were aware that Christianity was within most of the citizens and most of the people we call the founders thought of it in that way. So that they said that, where we ended up last podcast, we thought it'd be useful to make that examination.
Yeah, to take a look at that. And in episode 1, we started this journey. In episode 2, last episode, we kind of got into kind of a big question that would be good to explore before we launch out into is, what is a historian? What is it that they do? What's the health and dental like? Is that good? Is that something I should encourage my kids to do? And we had an interesting way of examining this thing of general question. How can we trust what we understand from history to be true? And you gave a really compelling example of how do we know that Julius Caesar was assassinated, and what we know about, well, how do we know that? And then all of a sudden that really becomes kind of a central question of, well, whatever we believe about history comes from this array of evidence. So any standard that we hold the Bible to, we certainly would have to hold to any other ancient document.
Exactly, because obviously Christianity or any other idea, so Roman law, is positing a value to us. Hey, y'all should do this. But not just why, because that's a different question, but it's like, can I even believe that they did that? Or can I believe the evidence that the proponents of X thing are saying, you should do this? It's like, well, wait, based on what? Oh, we have this evidence. Well, how do I know that evidence is legit? And so you can kind of get into it. If you want to, a way I like to think about it is like a series of questions. So for instance, how can you trust an ancient source when what you read is written hundreds of years after the event? right? So we know of an event and we date it in history, but then when we look for a source about it, sometimes it's like hundreds of years old before the first evidence we have is about that. And then we don't have any originals, but so since we don't have originals, we have copies, but those copies leave us variations, and sometimes those variants in the text, we're not clear. Sometimes it's very clear, like what's right. And we're going to do an episode about that later in the series. But you could say, wait a minute, the experts themselves, the best people we have on this aren't certain. Sometimes there's even contradictions. So when we looked at Julius Caesar last time, we noted that there are some contradictions in the historical sources. Maybe nothing that would lead a person to say, I don't believe the assassination happened. But it's still, if the story isn't clear through the evidence, that can raise questions.
Yeah.
And then lastly, when you think about the Bible, now this is a more specific thing to the Bible. We're going to have a whole episode about this because the Bible as it comes to us in modern times is usually considered a book, and it's a book with 66 parts. Now, what I like to say is it's really a library with 66 ancient manuscripts. So you can think of the different manuscripts individually, and I think it's useful to do so. We'll talk about what that all means later. But one could argue, well, wait a minute, didn't just certain people pick out different books that felt good or told a story? You know, all that kind of stuff is what we're trying to investigate, because if we're going to make this claim that there is this God and then he comes to earth and he represents this dude named Jesus, well, maybe someone 400 or 500 years after the supposed event just handpicked some different documents. And so we're going to look at, you know, those are all the kinds of questions you can ask in the process. So if you're going to recap it, what we learned last time is that the most important evidence for historians is written. Now, that's not to diss on any of my archaeological friends or the anthropologists in the room. It's just to say, when you have like a coin or what seems to be a remainder of a dagger or a pot, those can tell us things. We can find things in the ground that, okay, that was probably a latrine, or that might have been a place where there was wine making, but it doesn't give us clarity or detail. The written evidence does. And as I just said, we don't have any originals, what's often called the autograph or the autographa. And so we don't have those. Up to around 1100, there's some evidence we might have a few, 900. Recently, there was a finding that potentially in Hungary, I saw that there were some documents that people believed might be autographs from 900, which would be amazing. We'd love to have that. Obviously, if you're talking about cuneiform, something on like a clay tablet, or obviously hieroglyphics or some other writings that are on walls that archaeologists have found, we certainly have those, and those are the original. But again, the idea of written documentation. And what historians do is they work to recreate a singular, definitive edition or a compelling, most plausible narrative of the event. And if we're talking about the specific evidence, then of the evidence based on what we have. But we acknowledge that it is fundamentally impossible to recreate a document variant-free.
Now, why is that? Why is that not possible? Seems pessimistic.
Well, it's a great question. And first, let me say we're going to spend a whole episode kind of digging in. But you have to think about what goes on. It's not really fair to use the telephone game we all played as kids, but it's similar in the vein that as you're going along, if someone said, I want a copy of that. So it could be anything, but let's stick with the Bible. Somebody says, oh, there's this document that came to this certain location, and I would live in another location. I'd like to have a copy of that. Well, they would hand copy. That's the only way you could make a copy. And so the person doing it would obviously do all in their power to be equal, to be correct. But as you go forward in time, little bit by little bit, variations can step in, such as a misspelling. So imagine you were copying something page by page, and then as you read the line you wanted to copy, you knew all the words, but perhaps, like I struggle to spell the word because. It's just I can never get that word. I don't know where the A and the U go, and it throws me off. And luckily I've got a computer and it gives me the red underline going, wrong again. But if I was saying there was a sentence that had the word because in it, as I turned to write it on my new copy, I might misspell the word because. Well, down the road, somebody else wouldn't know that I had this problem, and they would just copy, if they were copying directly, my error. Now, again, that is an example. Later experts could say, it looks like this is a mistake. And literally what they can do when there's enough copies, and there are for the Bible, is they can like trace back in time and create almost a family tree. And they're usually able to triangulate down, okay, look, here's the moment where because was misspelled. And because of the locations of all the other documents, they're on a certain part of the world, they're able to kind of really figure out like, okay, these all came out of that era there. But sometimes it could be things like somebody might skip a line by accident because the end of the previous line or the beginning word of the previous line were similar. So their brain just skips. And remember, when these guys are making these copies, they're working in a room, sometimes 2, 3, 4 hours at a time, only natural light or candlelight, no eyeglasses. So even though they were very precise, there was nobody being cavalier about it because they were trained. This was a job people had, whether they're working for a noble or for a church or for a king, and they would write. Your job is to make copies, so the library always had like a backup of these very important documents. But as they're doing that, there can be little snippets of things that kind of work in there. Sometimes someone would see like let's not use because. Imagine it was a city name. Imagine it was a city name, and so they say to themselves, wait, I know this city. It's not spelled that way. So they're looking at the original, and they believe that's misspelled. So they would change it. Or if there was a city, like we have Deltona and DeLand nearby. Those are similar named cities. So imagine somebody who doesn't live here, but it's 500 years from now, and they're seeing something, they're going, DeLand, I know Deltona. And so they insert Deltona instead of DeLand. Well, again, down the road, someone else is trying to figure out what's the right way to deal with that. So those kinds of situations, and just the time that goes by in how someone, again, faithfully copying, the next person's like, okay, it's Deltona. So now we would have in the family of all the copies, was the city mentioned DeLand or was the city mentioned Deltona? And the person 1,000 years from now doesn't know. So they're going to have to do some research to come back to that. So that all leads to this setting where it's just really difficult. There were a lot of constraints on the original copyist. So to determine historicity, which is the word we've used before, two keys that I think and others feel are most helpful or kind of give us the greatest confidence is if the more copies we have, the better. There's only 9 copies. Well, if one says Deltona and 8 say DeLand, okay, maybe it is DeLand. But what if it's 5 and 4? But if you have 1,000 copies and now it's 200 and 800, and you can really trace out where the wrong or the changed name happened, which they can, well, the more copies you have, the better. And then the closer in time to the original, the better, because just less time for there to be issues that pop up. So when we can get back closer in time, that's better for us. And remember, the average number of manuscripts copies for a specific document is typically around 150. Some are a lot lower than that. Some are a little higher than that. Some are like the Iliad are a lot higher than that. And then the average time span is about 1,000 years. So when we say we know this thing happens, and then the first copy we have is 1,000 years later, no historian worries about that. That seems like a long time to a lot of non-historians, regular folk, but it's not. It's like a significant. It's like the average regular moment.
All right.
So anything less than 1,000 again is beneficial for us because it kind of makes us feel more confident that we're looking in. Okay, so. Now, what all that means is this, right? We have an event, the Julius Caesar thing we talked about. We have evidence that this thing happened. None of us were there, obviously. Writing's the most important evidence. So what can happen is we look at these events in history, we have maybe 5 to 10 different accounts or sources that we have. It could be a newspaper clipping, the equivalent of, could be a diary, could be somebody taking credit for it, could be a history written later. So that's more of a secondary source, but for our purposes, it's another piece of evidence. But for each one of these, then we have to discern how well we can trust it. And again, remember, the benefit of the doubt is with the document, the burden of proof is on the historian to say what I see written there isn't true. Even if what I see written may seem like it stretches for me, it may kind of strain credulity, I may have some reasons why I'm not sure I believe that, but I can't just impose into the document that, well, I'm not going to believe that if the document doesn't prove itself false in the process. So each document, each different account has copies made later in history. And so then we come back to that by looking at those historical documents. And so again, with Julius Caesar, we have strong evidence that we can say to support the claim that he was murdered. And we did kind of a cursory look at the support for those different writings, such as from Cicero or Sallust, who were his contemporaries. We kind of could see that same idea of the gap between the original that we know when it was written by Cicero or by Sallust, and then the first copies that we had. And we kind of talked our way through that. All right. So let's turn to the Bible.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. We're
Right.
kind of here to take this apart. So for the Old Testament, told you last time there are roughly 1,000 manuscript copies when you say the evidence for the Old Testament, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible, right? Now, when we're talking about the writings, it's important to realize in the Hebrew Bible, there is a collection of individual writings. So, for instance, you may have heard of, I know you have, the book of Judges, or the book of Ruth, or the Proverbs. So think of that as a separate volume you could pull out of a library and hold it separately.
Mm-hmm.
So these different document support manuscript evidence pieces are kind of, we look at it, when I say there's about 10,000, I'm talking about the collective. Some of them might only be for Judges. Some of them might be for a section that Judges is contained in, and some of those might be for the totality of what the Hebrews held up as their total document, if that makes sense. But let me just say one more thing here. When we say a copy and we count numbers of them, sometimes we are talking about the total document, right? So again, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, page 1 to the end. But sometimes we're talking about pieces of it. And sometimes we're talking about fragments that would be the equivalent of a piece of paper. Imagine you just tear off the bottom corner and it would have 8 or 9 lines and just kind of words kind of cut off halfway.
Right.
When experts are counting and saying we have this many copies, they're counting those. So don't hear whether 9, 250, or 10,000. Don't
complete.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and those are still useful for us because it allows the expert to say, even on this small little fragment, look, it's the same. They can figure out what page it came from, what section of the book it came from, because they have the whole book. And that gives them the strength to be able to say, okay, this still gives us insight as to what's kind of written there. All right. So I think it's important to sort of give a brief chronology, and we'll try to be brief, about the Old Testament, because this comes into us about the writing, right? So the first writing that we're told about occurs with a guy named Moses. And he's not the first events. If you read your Bible, he's not part of the first events, but he's the first one that we're told. There's 2 different spots where he's told, write this down. So we have this idea of him writing it, and then later there's moments when it's that's reflected back on. That writing that becomes the Hebrew Scripture is in 3 parts. By the way, the Jewish collectors put it together. We'll get into the depths of that later, but if you know anybody who's Jewish, or if you know of the Jewish Bible, you may have heard the word TaNaKh. And so the TaNaKh reflects, there's these 3 major sections of, first the Torah, which is where the first 5 books of, if you have a Bible, are in, the idea of what's often sometimes called the law. And then there's the prophets, and then there's the writings. Again, we'll go into more depth on that later. As we read through the Old Testament, you can see moments when, say, they had a national leader, a guy named Samuel, and he talks about writing things down, or they had one of these guys who we call prophets, a man named Jeremiah. We're told a very specific moment he writes stuff down. And so they kind of have this idea of they're collecting information as time goes by, and they're kind of building out the writings that they believe their God has told them are kind of important. And they have them and they keep them, and then sometimes they kind of lose them. So, for instance, there's a later king, a man named Josiah. He does some restoration work in the temple later on in the story, almost 800 years after we kind of learn about this guy Moses. And we're told in the story that they find a copy of the law.
And that's interesting, where we're looking at ancient manuscripts, but they're reflecting upon themselves. I mean, not reflecting upon themselves, but this is evidence that Scripture existed prior to this moment. Ancient as it is,
Right.
it was written, hidden away, forgotten, and then discovered again. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's really important for us because if we can say, okay, in 621, they found this copy. That's the date because it's connected to how it's ascribed of his kingship. So then we can say, all right, even if maybe, which we don't, our first copies are much younger than that, right? Then we can say, but we know it existed because they found it. And so then now at that point, at 621, there are stories and events that hadn't even happened yet. So they clearly were not written in at that moment, right? There's not a moment like in antiquity where the Bible and its books that we call in the Old Testament just magically existed. Because there is a sense of a real people living in real time collecting the writings that they believe God speaking to them or giving to them to preserve. So there's a sense of them sort of adding to as the events of time go by, right? Okay, so that's 621. Now before that, in 722, we know of the destruction of the northern half of the country that was the kingdom at that point was called Israel. That's 722 under the Assyrians. And then fast forward after the moment with Josiah, and the southern part is taken out. That's where the city of Jerusalem is. It was called Judah, 586, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. Then you go forward roughly 70 years where the Persians take over in the region. They conquer Babylon and Assyria both, and their kind of lead emperor is a man named Darius, and he sends the Jewish people back, or at least allows them to go back. They actually fund the building of a new temple that had been destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And so when this return happens, you kind of get a renewed interest in their own history. So these people coming back are kind of interested to know, well, what had God said in the history of our people, what we believe he said, and then how can we know what we should do to follow it? Because at that point, there's a very clear sense of most people is that, oh, we had this happen to us because we were punished. Now, that's a whole nother conversation we won't get into. But nonetheless, you can see then this post-exile period, after Assyria, after Babylon, this group coming back, and it's mostly we look at this group coming back from Babylon to the city of Jerusalem, that they have this idea of really wanting to build out the full collection, all right? So this is where you begin to hear of a group called the scribes. And basically, these are experts who are collectors of historical documentation, mostly with a religious bent, but still that's their whole journey. And if you study Hebrew history, you'll get different names. The most famous group is one of the last groups called the Masoretes. And from that, we get the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text is the text that is now most commonly used, although experts are still always working, for the Hebrew. So if you read a Bible today, the text that's there is usually translated into your language from what's called the Masoretic text. All right, so that's that period there. This is the moment, by the way, post-exile, that you pick up the last events that are in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. So figures you may have heard of if you've known the Bible at all. A guy named Ezra, a guy named Nehemiah, a lady named Esther, some people who speak for God, a man named Daniel who's in Babylon, and then others, really funny names, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, those kind of names. It's roughly about a 70-year window, 100 years or so from when Persia sends them back. So these guys are all kind of consumed and focused on this final collection of the stuff that God has said. Malachi is considered like the last prophet to speak. So that's somewhere between 460 to 430 BC. And then after that, that's the kind of sense of the closing of the text. Now, again, there's more things that happen in Jewish history, and there's more writings that occur in this same time period that are important. And again, we'll look at some of those, later in the journey, right? But so let me just sort of date this as we're going, right? So when we're looking at the Bible, we know these events happen. So there we are at 4-something BC, and we know this kind of 500, them coming back. Our best preserved copy of the Hebrew text in Hebrew was from around 925 AD. So that's 1,500 years or so from the moment we know of it. Now, there's some other texts that we have that we begin to discover. So very famously in 1947, and then after that in 1951 and some others, there's texts that we begin to find that gave us scrolls of the Old Testament from which they were dated to the BC era. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are typically dated to around 125. There's another group of scrolls that are dated to around 170 BC, some of those early AD period. But in other words, far closer to that closing of the text with Malachi in that 925 moment, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when you can do that, you say, okay, I know we have this moment. We don't have an original. We have this moment when, let's say, the last collected writing existed. And now I've got my best preserved copy from 925. There's another really good one called the Leningrad Codex in early 1000. And you say, okay, that's what we have. Now I get these new documents in the 20th century and I can compare them. And what they found, and we're going to go into more depth on this later, what they found was that there was literally very few changes or variations from the documents in the 125 BC period to, so over 1,000 years, the detail, the care, the focus of the preservation was such that it had very little variation. So that gives us great confidence in those AD documents, because we can go back to the BC documents and say, okay, we're very close in time now, and that helps us gain confidence as we look at the older writings of the Old Testament.
Nice.
So the Old Testament is well preserved.
Mm-hmm.
The New Testament is even better preserved.
All right.
Now, some of that's logical because it's younger, right?
Right.
All those writings from the first century. Why don't you walk us through, just real briefly, kind of a New Testament journey timeline? So we were in Malachi 430.
All right.
So flash forward to 30 AD-ish. Jesus of Nazareth has had a 3-year ministry, is arrested by Jewish authorities. He is transferred to the court of Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor for that region. And I think most people would generally understand what followed that, whether they believe it or not. They know he's found guilty. He was killed by crucifixion. And according to followers, 3 days later, comes back to life. Based on this miraculous happening, there's a small group of believers, small but fervent, and they begin telling this story and expressing their belief that Jesus was the long-promised Savior, and they refer to him as Messiah. And then, over the next year or so, these fervent followers spread out from Jerusalem to the surrounding areas, and they have converts, including those who are not of Jewish ancestry. And this is based on their personal testimony of the guy they believed in being killed, coming back to life, eyewitness accounts. So around 32 AD, we have a guy named Saul, who is a leading Jewish scholar. He himself is converted, and by his own testimony, which has been repeated multiple times, he is converted by Jesus himself.
That's his claim.
That's his claim.
Yep.
Take it or leave it. That's his story. That he interacted with a ascended Jesus himself. His name is changed to Paul.
We don't know why that happened, do we?
I've
One of us should know this, and I don't think I know this.
I have always. Oh, he became a Christian. He goes from Saul to Paul. I don't know that it's that crystal clear.
Yeah. There's a couple other people that we read about in the historical documents who were with Jesus when he was alive.
Yeah.
And he did some name stuff.
Right.
And maybe, I don't know, maybe privately he told him when he came to see that. We're told, according to Paul, the thing Jesus says to him. We don't have to get into that. But he doesn't mention names there that I remember.
we kind of, you're always looking for the narrative and you're like, before, after, Saul, Paul, yada, yada. You're like, well, all right, that may be the case. I'm not sure it's spelled out in that level of specificity.
Hey, if you're listening and you think you have the answer for this, please feel free to write in and share.
Yes, that would be great. So Paul becomes like the guy starting around 47 AD.
And the larger part of the New Testament are actually letters written by him. So you think about emails that you have sent and
Yeah, we just have
correspondence.
Yeah. And we know from some things he said and other people said that there were more letters, but we have this certain collection.
These are the ones that
Yeah.
were believed to be necessary. And his first letter is to churches in a region called Galatia, where he had success spreading his belief in Jesus. That's around 49 AD, and that's the book of Galatians.
Yep.
Aptly named. Great call on that. No notes. And the last letters and the other writings from the late 50s, maybe the early 60s. And again, these are when we say 50s, like the 1950s. These are the OG.
Yeah, exactly.
The 50s.
Right.
The 60s. And then the final writing is a combination of some letters and a type of writing that speaks about the future, apocalyptic writing. And those are called the Book of Revelation. And again, this is New Testament in general. And the best idea is those are written around 90 AD, possibly earlier.
Yeah.
By a guy named John.
Yeah. Well, and the scholar, just so everybody knows, we're aware that there is scholarship you can find that dates these differently. So this is really the key point for you and me. We're going to just say, well, we don't know.
Right.
And we're going to say, okay, well, let's talk about the dating then. What can we know about the dating? So right out of the bat, here's one of the first things. We have manuscript fragments that are dated to around 95 to 98 AD. So that's for the book of John.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the writings, one of the histories, bios about Jesus, right? So just that we have a fragment, some experts will say, oh, that's later. It's like 125. Okay, I'll give you 125, right? If it's 125, then clearly John cannot have been written in 200 because we have a fragment that's dated to 125. And again, the experts have all these ways that they do dating of the writing material, the type of script, a whole bunch of different things the experts get into. But the point for you and me is we have this, and it was discovered along the Nile. So very, very far from where we know John was when he was writing. So for it to have traveled, it's not modern, would have taken some time. So we get this idea of more than likely this is a copy. More than likely, there would have been an original predating. This is not a copy of the autograph from 95 or 98. This is a copy of the writing.
Yeah.
So, it's hard to say any dates with any degree of certainty, but more than a year, let's say that, more than likely.
Yeah.
So you can bring John back even further in that regard. We also have other larger fragments that are in the 2nd century. So we have one for John that's somewhere between 110 and 150. We have one for the writing from a man named Matthew that's roughly 150 to 175. Revelation, the one you just mentioned, we have a fragment that's somewhere 100 to 180. And again, I know somebody go, well, that's a large break. I get it, 100 to 180, but we're not saying 100 to the year 1080.
Right.
The experts they can't usually get too precise like to day, month, year.
And it narrows as new evidence comes up.
Correct.
Like, look, being totally accurate based on the facts we have, this is the range. Sorry. It may tighten up later.
And so even if it is late, so like 175, 150, again, this is not a fragment of the autograph. This is a fragment of the copy.
Right.
So you have to imagine copies of copies of copies moving along. So you definitely go back years depending on where it's located, but more than likely these definitely give us confidence that these documents were in the 1st century. As we were saying, we have larger collections of all the books. So they began to kind of find value in having all the books, and they have larger collections of that going around the 200s and into the early 300s. Now, there's a side note here. It's important for us to realize that in the late 200s and the early 300s is the coming of Emperor Diocletian. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on with Diocletian. We actually talked about him in the previous podcast. But one of the things he does is he tries to eliminate all the writings that the Christians had. So he went on a crusade, about 10 years of focused effort to try to destroy the documents. The fact that we have anything that predates 300 tells us, one, the value that the Christians held in it, but two, I think it also tells us about the probably the larger number of these writings that were occurring. It gives us great confidence as we're trying to date these things to see, is this document writing of Acts or that Galatian thing you mentioned, is it legitimately dated properly? And the evidence just begins to come overwhelmingly that we do. And finally, around 350, we have 3 large collections that are named connected to where they are now or where they were found. So there's Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. So all 3 of those are dated in the 350 range, and it's the whole New Testament, all 27 documents. So just in general, if someone were to say, I think some of the things in the New Testament are mythical, well, most experts in the area of myth will say that there's roughly a 300 to 500 year time needed for myth to build up. And generally that's because we do have a living memory that extends further back. Like your parents are still alive, my mother's alive. They can tell you about their grandparents. And your parents, you Matthew, may be in a place where your parents could tell you stories that they learned from their grandparents about something from their grandparents. So there's a living actual memory that goes back over a century, century half in some cases, depending on the story, depending on the person, right? So when you say a myth, it just can't really build until all that's gone.
Right.
So that's 300 to 500 years. So here we have right at a roughly a 300-year window, the full copy. Now, if this was the only copy, and we didn't have those earlier ones, maybe someone could argue there's some mythical things that were inserted by somebody, we just don't know where. But instead, we have lots of deep manuscript copy in that process. I mean, to me, that's just, we need to stop there for a second and go, that's amazing that we have that depth of writing and historical support. That's not a word, I didn't say it well, but that's support for the historicity of the documents.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe kind of an outlier in terms of comparable documents.
Absolutely. I mean, I use the phrase with my students, it kind of blows the curve, although I don't really think when I say that they actually know what a curve is, so maybe I need to quit saying what that means, but maybe they think baseball.
I was told there would be no math in this class.
Yeah, seriously. Okay, so now sticking with just the New Testament, another thing that historians do, and we're just going to focus right now just again on the New Testament and kind of bring this episode to a close, is that you start looking for other pieces of evidence or clues to help you date things. So again, we've got these documents. We see some evidence that suggests, Galatians was written in 49. I'm saying all the other letters are written between 50 and 60, but somebody else could say, yeah, but the first copies are in 150. Maybe they're still written in 150. So, okay, great point. We want to be fair to that. We want to look and see. We just want to find out where the documents lie relative to date. So there's internal and external clues in the process. And at least let me give you an example, right, from non-biblical, right? So there's a guy named Josephus who writes a document. It's called the Antiquities of the Jews, one of the most important writings of the history of the Jewish people from an early first century point of view. Writes it around 94 AD and kind of wrote it in the first century. Our first copy of that in I think he wrote it, I'm pretty sure he wrote it in Greek, is about 1,000 years later. They're about the 10th and 11th centuries. Okay, so that's 1,000 years. We say that's the normal. But we can go back and find that we have translations in Latin and we have translations in Syriac, which give us an earlier date. Now, again, they're not the Greek, right? So it's a translation, but we can say, if nothing else, we know it existed. Somebody can't say, oh, well, I think this document is actually a forgery or it's kind of made up. Someone wrote it in 600 or something, or at the time of the Crusades. Like, no. We have a copy from the 3rd or 4th century that quotes it or is a direct translation. And they actually have some quotes from it, from other writers who quote Josephus at different times that bring us very close back in time to within maybe a couple hundred years of Josephus. So that kind of information helps us as we're trying to find dating. So that would be an external evidence source to kind of what I'm trying to point out here. So when you look at the New Testament, let's do internal first. Mm-hmm. In some of those letters, there are moments when the author, almost always Paul, occasionally there's a couple other people, and they quote something. Now, again, for you and me reading in English, it might be difficult to see. I mean, obviously the editors could put quote marks in there, but then we can say, how do you know that? When you look at the original language, there's the equivalent of like a quote mark, basically. The language shifts. These experts who get into learning these documents learn the cadence, learn the vocabulary, learn the writing style of these authors. I told you I've done research on a British naval sea captain from the Napoleonic Wars. And so I spent time doing research on him, and I got to have his ship log books that he wrote in. And I remember the first couple of days of looking at his material, it was like deciphering some language I don't understand, but they was writing in English. But over time, I was able to really pick up the cadence and the writing style of my sea captain. So that when I was finished, I could read him very quickly because I'd gotten used to the way he wrote. And if something odd had appeared in the document, I would notice that. These experts can see this. And so they begin to notice there's places in some of these various letters. There's one in a book called Romans. There's one in a book called the Philippians. There's one in Thessalonians. These all are quoting some kind of material, and it's mostly creedal material, meaning it's like a formulated statement, almost like, think about like our Pledge of Allegiance. It's kind of a creed. We don't think of it that way, but it really is kind of a creedal statement about belief in the United States.
Structure, different type of writing.
And when you're a kid, you're learning certain things about the country where there's kind of this flow that you memorize. You may have learned like a Boy Scout creed, or there might have been other things that you had to memorize about a certain group that you joined. So all that information kind of tells us this is something learned. Well, one of the best ones is in a writing to the city of Corinth. And we'll go into this in more depth later, but the long story short is these suggest to us this existed, the belief statement existed before the writing. So if we know that Corinthians or Philippians was written in, say, 52 or 53, the creedal thing he remembered or quoted had to predate that at least a little bit. So that helps us get further back. And when you're talking about trying to understand, did these people actually believe Jesus rose from the dead, for instance? Or is that just something made up in 150 or something? These creedal statements all talk about the crucifixion. They talk about resurrection. They'll name names. There's a couple other types of things that are quoted. There's some songs or poems that are quoted. Again, these are talking about the belief structure of the people at that time. They would have predated the writing of the letter. So all those things kind of give us this strength to say, oh, okay, this is something that they believed about this figure Jesus. And all of these, by the way, predate the Gospels. So when you read the four Gospels, the bios of Jesus, if people are like, oh, I'm not sure those things happened, or I'm not so sure I believe those things, or that might have been made up 200 or 300 years later, we can say, no, we've got a creedal statement that agrees with or asserts the same position about who they saw Jesus to be. And so that dates before the gospel. So it gives us this greater confidence when you look at the internal sense of writing, that there is the dating of the belief is earlier and closer to the time. Again, like you said, Jesus's moment was around 30 AD. And if we've got creedal statements or songs that are written in 35, 36, 37 AD, I mean, that's, in historical terms, that is like yesterday.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what about external? Right? So in external evidence, a couple things. Easy one's archaeology. So the archaeology provides us corroborating evidence. You can use this, by the way, also for the Old Testament. And I'll just say in a summary sense, because I know we're running along. In the 20th century alone, and now moving into the early 21st century, archaeology has continued to bring forward amazing finds, F-I-N-D-S, of important evidence that supports the evidence of the first kings or some of the kings in the Israeli history, location of certain cities in the Promised Land, the evidence of external people, kings or leaders, locations that are mentioned in the gospel. And again, these are all things that external to the document gives us confidence in the writing of the documents. And, you know, sometimes if a document says there's a certain city and then the archaeologist can go to this location and never find the city, that's the kind of thing that we start going, okay, wait a minute, maybe that document's making things up. And so it raises questions for us. Then another bit of external evidence is a group of the second followers. We call these people the church fathers. So if you have the original group that you mentioned who followed Jesus, well, they all had disciples. They all went places, like you mentioned, Paul going places and others. And so then of those people, leaders emerge. We have their letters. So these are all roughly from around 80 to 250 AD. So they got all kinds of letters they wrote to people, wrote to churches, made theological things. Think about sermons sometimes. In those letters, they quote what we call the New Testament, to the point that roughly 95% of the New Testament is quoted by these people. So again, just get the point I'm making here, from a dating point of view. Somebody's like, oh, I don't think the Bible was written until 200. Well, I've got a letter from a guy in 90 who's quoting it. Right. So if he's quoting it, just like I said with Josephus, if he's quoting it, it has to have existed before he quotes it. So when we know it's quoting it from, if he's quoting from 125, then it has to be before 125. It can't be something in 250 or 300. So that's an example, again, of that early witnesses. And I get it. People say, well, yeah, but they're fans of Jesus or they're fans of the Christian movement. I understand they're sympathetic witnesses, but nonetheless, it's still evidence that helps you and me in the dating process. That's all we're talking about today, is the dating process. Look, we need to wrap it up, but let me just close with this kind of to me, one of the most important things. Jesus and the Christian movement and aspects about Jesus are noted in a several variety of non-Christian sources. Josephus, who I mentioned already, he's one. In fact, there's just been some brand new scholarship by a man named Tom Schmidt, who's just going deeper into examination about Josephus and what he wrote and the validity of it or not in his examination of the story. So these authors, Josephus writes about him, Tacitus writes about him, Pliny the Younger writes about him. We used Pliny's letter in the previous podcast. Actually, just yesterday with my students, we got to this point in our study of ancient Western civilization history, and I gave them these primary sources. And I said, well, what facts can we see? No agenda, not trying to drive anybody anything, just what's there. And when you look at all these sources, and there's about 40 of them, and I'll put some of these, I'll try to link some of these in the show notes so you can go read them yourself. None of these are saying, yeah, we believe in Jesus. None of them are saying that they think Jesus was this, you use that word Messiah. None of them are saying that. None of them are saying that this is the greatest thing we've heard. In fact, most of these are saying these people are freaks. This thing is dangerous. That guy Jesus was accused of like the occult or witchcraft or some freaky stuff. And so they're being negative. And that's fine. What you and I are doing as a historian is we're just trying to say, I've got these 27 writings. Are these legit? Or, were they made up in 500 years later by somebody who just had an agenda? And so here I've got these early sources. Most of the ones that we really look at themselves were written somewhere between 50 AD and like 150 AD. So there's more after that, but these are the close ones, right? When you look at these, I want to close here with a quote by Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, who is professor emeritus at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And he wasn't a Christian when he started doing a study of this stuff. He says this: we can conclude that we would know that first, Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Second, many people believe that he performed healings and exorcisms, called sorcery in the Roman text often. Third, that some people believed he was the Messiah, and we haven't really explained what that means, but that's an important word for the Jewish people. Fourth, he was rejected by the Jewish leaders. Fifth, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. These are, again, Roman officials. One's the emperor, Tiberius. One's a governor. You and I could track these names down. Sixth, despite this shameful death, his followers, who believed he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine, so that there are multitudes of them in Rome by AD 64. And seventh, all kinds of people from the cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God. Again, that's Dr. Edwin Yamauchi. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. The point for you and me is when we have these non-Christian sources, they're an external bit of evidence that gives us the dating. None of them are saying the story about Jesus is legit, like he really was the Son of God, or that he really raised from the dead. They're not saying that at all. They're just saying this supports a lot of the key evidential facts. And from that, we can just be so overwhelmingly confident.
And that's a quote from Dr. Yamauchi, is a kind of a great way of maybe kind of wrapping this up and then looking ahead. So again, this is all to this point from an academic, from a historical point of view. So looking at the person of Jesus, there's more evidence that he existed, and let's just leave it existed right now. That more existed evidence that he existed than the founder of any other religion, more than any other figure in antiquity. And then again, looking over here at the Bible as a document of antiquity, that collection of ancient manuscripts that we call the Bible is the most historically secure work of antiquity. And it's not even close when you kind of compare it, again, from that purely academic and historic point of view. Where do we go from here? Well, we will get into that next time. And looking forward to that.
Absolutely, man. Good stuff.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.